Yes, good evening, everyone. If I may request everyone to please settle down. We'll just be starting very shortly. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. On the behalf of Sustainable Development Policy Institute, I welcome you all to SDPI's 27th Annual Sustainable Development Conference, From Fragility to Resilience, Enhancing Sustainable Development. And especially invite you all to this plenary session on the legal framework for climate finance in Pakistan. So the session will be moderated by Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, who's currently the Executive Director of Sustainable Development Policy Institute. We're very pleased to have been joined by Justice Jawad Hassan from Lahore High Court, who will be briefing us about the framework for climate finance in Pakistan, the legal framework of climate finance in Pakistan. Along with Justice Jawad, we have also been joined by Mr. Syed Buland Sohail, the Advocate High Court and Managing Partner of Sohail and Partners LLP. We are also very pleased to have been joined by Mr. Khurram Lalani online. Khurram Saab is currently working as the Principal of Resources Future and also the lead of Climate Finance Accelerator UK. Thank you so much, Khurram Saab, for joining us. And also along with that, we have been joined by Professor Petra. She is the Professor of International Law at University of Durham, UK, and Professor Dr. Christian from Martin Luther University, Halle. So thank you once again for joining us. And with this, let me invite Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri for his official inaugural and setting the scene for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ubaid. So first of all, my gratitude to the panelists who have joined us online. And this session we tailored to discuss the legal framework for climate finance. So as you will be listening a lot about climate financing over the next 4 days, we thought that it's imperative and it's important that one should also know that what sort of legal framework can be to ensure that climate finance, the definitional issues, the access issue, the transparency issues, the whole definition of vulnerability and the whole definition of who is vulnerable. And if you are following the flash floods in Spain for last couple of days, where 250 precious lives have lost to a flood. So Spain is as vulnerable, climate vulnerable, as any other country. And to discuss it all, we have requested Justice Jawad Hassan, Honorable Judge of Lahore High Court, to give us a scene-setting talk, and afterward I'll come for the podium discussion, style discussion. So over to you, Jawad Saab. You have around 15 to 20 minutes to set the scene and walk us through the legal framework of climate finance.
Good afternoon. Welcome you all. Thank you, Suleri Saab. The first issue is that what is climate finance law in Pakistan, and what are the legal framework Pakistan has to offer? The most importantly is when last year when we spoke at the COP28 in Dubai with Justice Shah, there I raised the issue of climate finance, and Pakistan was at that time became the member of Loss and Damage Fund. The issue that Pakistan suffering the worst in a vulnerable country to have this climate impact. What are the questions for the world to know is when we speak about, and almost 1 year we spoke everywhere, including Durham and all, in London and all continents, 5 continents, subject called were the framework of climate finance. Every donor, every multilateral banks, and even these local donors has asked us 3 basic questions. That their first is whether is there any legal framework of climate finance law in Pakistan today, and if yes, how the climate finance is protected and secured in Pakistan, and third, if there's any disputes in that finance locally or internationally, how will the courts look into it? So my talk now will be focusing on how Pakistan is mapping in the international climate finance framework. Is the first, and I say we have 5
basic frameworks for climate finance in Pakistan. The first and the most important framework is the constitutional framework of climate finance. As we speak today, almost 10 days ago, Pakistan got the 26th Amendment in the Constitution. And Pakistan now proudly tells the world that Pakistan has a right to environment in the Constitution now. 9A of the new law clearly states to have a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a fundamental right in the Pakistani Constitution, which was not there since 1951, the Constitution of 73. It's the first time Pakistan got the fundamental rights, and we, in absence of that right, Pakistan Supreme Court in the Shala Zia case interpreted the word life means right to a healthy environment. And that was the principle of the Stockholm Principle. The right to clean air and clean water is a fundamental right of every citizen. So first, we have the constitutional framework of the right to environment now in the Constitution. Secondly, that Constitution itself states and clearly focuses
on one word, which is the fourth list, that any international document and treaties can be implemented in Pakistan by the federal government. And then the point is, there are the Federal Rules of Business 73 of the Constitution. It gives the Ministry of Climate Change a division which have the mandate to make policy. So at the first constitutional level, you have 9A, Article 9, Article 14, right to dignity, and that is read with the international commitments. With climate finance is an international obligation of the global south or a global north, and the international obligation as envisaged in the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, 1992, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, some articles which Dr. Christian will speak to you about them, the legal binding documents and non-legal binding documents, and then some of the international documents where they say, talking about Agenda 21, Earth Charter, where South was to be given funds by the North internationally after certain conferences happened. So Pakistan has a constitutional mandate as a right. It has a federal rules of business. It has provincial rules of business, and it has something which is very important. The most important thing is that the Constitution itself recognizes environmental right as a right now. Why I have to give the constitutional framework to the world, and also the judgments of the Supreme Court are binding as a sovereign law under Article 189, that any judgment of a Supreme Court, if it decides a question of law, shall be binding on the courts below, is only on one ground. When you're looking at the climate finances, some are through contractual agreements. Mostly are preferring in the world a model. What is climate finance law? Climate finance law is just a set of rules, regulation, and a case law giving a framework to a climate finance, to a financial mechanism, through a mapping how the forums and modalities you have to deal with it. And some modalities are done through mostly right now through an agreement. And any agreement, if they write an agreement, they can say that whereas Pakistan recognizes right to environment, right to sustainable environment as a fundamental right, Pakistan courts have protected that right, recognized that right, and also enshrined that right in the Constitution. That's kind of first legal constitutional framework of the right. Second, and the most important framework for Pakistan to the whole world, which we can say, is the statutory framework. The statutory framework is very important because Pakistan is one of the few countries in the world which has ratified, signed, incorporated 16 international multilateral environmental agreements into its own domestic law. Unlike Germany, unlike France, unlike other countries, we are not monistic view, we have the dualistic transformative rule. Any instrument Pakistan signs, it has to then incorporate and ratify into the domestic law. So Pakistan, the good news to share with you is that the Pakistan Environmental Protection Act, which was after the devolution, it came to provinces. That is called the Environmental Protection Act of 97. It has section 31 of that law, which mentions the schedule. And luckily, with good news, UNFCCC 92, that convention is a part of our law now. And that convention, section 31 of Pakistani law of every provinces, says that that the government shall make rules to implement the provisions of the multilateral environmental agreements, including United Nations Framework for Climate Change, 1992. From Kyoto to Paris Agreement, that was a basic, obligatory, fundamental constitution covenant to follow for Pakistan. So government has a framework to make kind of a rule on climate finance as per section 31 of that law, which they will do now after the COP or during COP. Second, most importantly, is section 33 of that law makes regulations to the agency. Rule is made by the government, which they can make for climate finance, and regulations are made by the environmental protection agencies. Regulation 33(2) and 33(d) makes that government, EPA, can make regulations for measurement and to protection of finance, which is the climate finance. So they can work out a kind of small rule regulations to help out the donors, the local donors, to help out climate finance. And third, and most importantly, in the environmental law, which is that there is then the provision of the Pakistan Environmental Protection Act. The preamble is very clear. The framework of the Pakistani law, which is a special law, says it's an act to provide for the protection, conservation, management of environment and sustainable development. So there's a very direct gateway, which is the preamble of the law, mentioning that. So this comes to the second framework of statutory framework after the constitutional framework, and most importantly is framework which is now we are using, and I've been using in the courts, and I've talked about the judgments, is the regulatory framework, which is now the State Bank of Pakistan has given the green initiative. The Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, the regulatory body, has given the green schemes and green policies. There are the documents made by that. How the regulators can function is in the judgment on the State Bank. I gave the judgment, which is PLD 2023, Lahore 392, the judgment that State Bank is a regulator, regulates the entire banking sector in Pakistan under the State Bank Act of 1956, and also it regulates banks under the Banking Companies Ordinance 1962. That section of 41 of the Banking Companies Ordinance 1962, State Bank has directly the mandate to direct the banks that if for the public interest it is satisfied, to make some kind of give some kind of direction for green financing. The banks can go to that model. It is, and the banks are bound to comply as per section 41 of the Banking Companies Ordinance 62, which they did once, and now there is another provision, section 41(2) of the same ordinance of the State Bank, which says the State Bank can also give guidelines. Now, the green financing, we have the mechanism available. They only need to do is, the law is there. Law provides that they can make some kind of a policy. They can make some kind of policy for the banks to use this kind of a carbon credit and something else to talk about to clarify the issue, because we have a very good framework. Pakistan has been one of the forefront country which came out to protect the environment after 1972 Stockholm Conference. Pakistan had the law since 1983. Pakistan Supreme Court, Pakistan Ministry of Climate Change, they've done a lot of work for Pakistan. And Pakistan was the only country last year in COP28 where the legal panel was discussed. Pakistan's stance was that 49 events in the Park Pavilion. Pakistan is there to talk about this climate issue and climate finance. And secondly, the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, which regulates the entire capital market, the companies, the insurance companies. This issue of climate finance law is intertwined, interlinked with all the other sectors. So Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan functions under the Securities and Exchange Act 1997. And in my judgment, another judgment, I declared its role as a regulator, 2021 CLD 931, where Section 20, subsection 4 of the SCCP Act, it can give some guidelines and policies for green financing, which is now we have the constitutional framework, we have the statutory framework of the environment specializing, we have the regulatory framework. The sectors dealing with climate finance would be the SCCP controls the companies, SCCP controls the insurance, SCCP controls some banks and the State Bank too. So these are the two, and they have already, in my paper which I shared with you, they have already made green guidelines and some kind of a scheme to talk about the foreign investor to local investor, that they can deal with something which is on climate finance. And then SCCP also dealing with this as a new trend coming in. Sometimes they're winding up petitions filed under the issue of climate change, which is something people go to the constitution jurisdiction, people go to other jurisdiction, and then few cases which was filed in my court was that they need to wound up a company. It was going against the environment on some grounds, ultra vires use memorandum grounds, not convening other things. So those things are still under the pipeline. The world is focusing into it. And those are the three framework there is. One and the most important framework which Pakistan proudly represent the world. Pakistan every month speaks about that, is Pakistan's judiciary, the powerful judiciary which has led the world becoming #1 10 times. The concept of Pakistan judgments, that Pakistan judiciary is the first judgment in the world in 94, when you don't have a right to environment, the right to life, under the Stockholm principles of precautionary principles, is right to a healthy environment in 94. Pakistan, and the second time, is the first country in the world, Justice Mansoor Shah, the judgment of Asghar Laghari, the judgment on climate mitigation, that is a judgment 2018 when world took into it, and every country now, what we learned from the West, the first time Pakistan judgment came, now every country is now have the cases of climate change, climate finance, there are cases coming in Europe, in Africa, called copycat cases. So Pakistan led the first judgment in 2018, the Asghar Laghari, most cited, most referred, most talked about Pakistan judgment of Justice Shah. Third, Pakistan became first time in the world is when I gave the judgment of climate adaptation in 2019. Sheikh Asim Farooq taught some universities abroad, picked it up, that the concept of dubious nature concept was that Pakistan has to now tackle climate change through adaptation. Adaptation was the plantation of trees, some policies, and what I led was they could go for the peri-urban policy for deforestation in the cities to control this kind of a smog and kind of a pollution in the cities. That was the Pakistan. Then Pakistan, the courts came out and started giving judgments on the touching upon the international issues. Pakistani courts led the world by talking about right to food security. In the Abu Bakr case, lots of cases was coming out from Pakistan Supreme Court. And luckily, a few months ago, Supreme Court had the huge conference, a very big conference on environment and climate change, where everything was talked about. That was the judicial anthology of the Pakistani jurisprudence. And so far, 610 cases have been passed by Pakistani courts, including 110 by the Supreme Court. This is a very important issue for Pakistan because its issue is a global issue and a local issue. What is the Pakistan's theme? When we are going into COPs, we represent Pakistan every month abroad, and we always tell people to say that
Pakistan COPS themes are always talked about by the world. What happened in Egypt 2 years ago, that what happens in Pakistan doesn't remain in Pakistan. This is the theme. Pakistan has always had a hashtag theme in the world because Pakistan is suffering. 8 million people displaced from this because courts and the government and every institution is working very hard to protect this. And we're looking for the financing from the world in kind of the grants, in kind of the loans, in kind of what the issue is, the GEF, the GCF, the other issues. Now, and the last part to talk about is because this has been with us for so many years, we can use the same word. 100 years ago, it was called environmental, it was called nuisance. 80 years ago, it was called negligence. 60 years ago, it was called tort. Then it was called environmental protection. And then it called 10, 20, 30 years ago, environmental management. Then it became the environmental justice. Then it became the climate justice. Now it becomes climate finance. It's the same word, same issue. The trend is changing because of the global outreach and the global commitments Pakistan has made, and the world is making too. The last one with the international framework, as you know, Kyoto and Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, which Christian will speak about. My main theme today was how do we protect the climate finance in Pakistan? That is what I always speak about. In 2 minutes, I explain that there's a symbiotic relationship of the climate finance, ADR, and the commercial courts. Because every country, if they want to fund Pakistan, if the locals want to fund on an project of mitigation, carbon sink, project of adaptation, they need to know what is the dispute clause they have. Whether it's an arbitration, whether it's a mediation, if an arbitration, what is the forum? It is the venue. What is the language? Where is the arbitration be held? And good news for Pakistan is that in the last 2 years, we picked up the ADR ecosystem. Supreme Court is a committee. I'm the member of that committee. We resolved with them. That is that Pakistan is bringing out a new act of arbitration. Pakistani courts have given judgments on pro-enforcement bias. We have the commercial courts because commercial courts and the climate finance, they are intertwined and critical interdependence on each other. And the issue with the commercial court is the judgment we're giving on is that we have to protect the foreign investment in Pakistan, whether it's in climate finance, in whether form, they need to know whether there is a dispute, which court will decide if the award is taken by the London courts or Dubai or Singapore. What is the Pakistan's courts is, Pakistan courts are now coming out with new jurisprudence called pro-enforcement bias. We have to enforce the award. Supreme Court judgment of TIC 24 SCMR page 640, my judgment last year, settle case, that we need to focus on that if something is coming to Pakistan, it's a court's duty to focus that and protect that. And those commercial courts and those environmental courts will look into every project when it comes to mitigation or adaptation and how the project is well spent. We are training judges at the academies. We are training lots of this kind of courses for judges to be taught on the commercial side, and the environmental judges taught on the environmental side. And that's why we have the MOU with Durham University, Durham Law School, where Petra will speak about it, that we are now training our judges to talk about climate change, climate law. And this is what Pakistan's future is. And I must conclude to say that I'm grateful to the government of Pakistan for inviting us to COP29 this year. And I'm grateful to STPI for holding this kind of a thing. This is like I call them a pre-prep-com for our COP29. We have lots of events in COP29, and we wish Pakistan to succeed in convincing the North, what we call is the global North to global South. Funding is needed to countries, and Pakistan is one of the most deserving countries for climate grants, not loan. Thank you.
you very much, Justice Hassan, for highlighting a couple of important areas, the constitutional provisions in the Constitution of Pakistan for ensuring why a state should be responsible for providing protection against environmental and climate change catastrophes and its linkage with climate finance, for outlining the international architecture of climate finance, for providing some of the provisions in domestic laws and some of the domestic legal case studies. And finally, by proposing three pillars of the possible framework. It is very helpful, and ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are working in climate finance, while we keep on trying to increase access for climate finance, have more funds allocated for climate finance, I think after listening to Justice Jawad, you must have got an idea that even if such a fund is there, unless and until we know the legal provisions, it would be extremely difficult to get benefit of it. I'll come to my in-person participant, Sohail, but before Sohail, if you allow me, let me take at this point Professor Christine Tschite, who is from Martin Luther University, Wittenberg, Germany, and he will present the significance of climate finance for developing countries and Pakistan. Over to you, Professor Tschite.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very an honor to be with you virtually, hopefully sometimes in the future also in present, and discussing with you these important issues of climate finance. I will talk for 10 minutes in addition and supplementing what has just been said on the international legal framework for climate finance, which of course is at the heart, as you all know, of COP29 next week and the following week in Baku. And the background to political development in this regard is not too promising, but I'm not pessimistic. Let's keep and stay optimistic. But you all followed the development last week and this weekend on the Conference of the Parties with regard to the Convention on Biodiversity. And as you all know, it unfortunately ended abruptly without a result, and because of our issue today, because of finance. Biodiversity finance, climate finance, there's a lot of similarities in this regard. And as you probably followed the news, it was a clash between the Global South and the Global North with regard to the question how and by whom and in which dimension we should finance this biodiversity, second biggest environmental challenge next to climate change. So we have to see. I don't know whether it's a good or a bad sign what we witnessed just last week, but we should stay optimistic for Baku. So what is this is what I'm going to discuss with you with, as I said, about 10 minutes. I'm going through the provisions that are the more concrete legal background of climate finance, what will be discussed in Baku next week, and also some additional thoughts, namely on the question how to solve the issue, who is going to, who's responsible for climate finance. I said already, and we all know, climate finance is the main topic in Baku. It will be the climate finance COP. That is clear, and we have already a lot of diplomatic, political, and also scientific initiatives in order to solve the challenge ahead. It's a very complex issue also in terms of negotiations and how to conduct negotiations. I can, of course, here only touch upon some very basic aspects of the complex picture. The background for climate finance is, of course, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that has already within it, you see it here on the slide, an obligation of climate finance based on the overall and most important principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. As you might know, in the old days, under the Framework Convention, at the starting of the entire process, we had a strict differentiation between the so-called annex countries that were then only a limited number of countries being obliged for financial assistance. The second most important development then was COP15 in Copenhagen, even though as such COP15 was more or less a failure. There was at least a result with regard to issues of climate finance, and it was the issue of $100 billion per year up to until 2020 for climate finance. This was these obligations on climate finance were put on a new ground with the Paris Agreement, making the financial support of all the issues of climate change an obligation of all parties, with a certain differentiation, of course, between developing and developed countries. Article 2, Paris Agreement, and Article 9 are the decisive provisions in this regard. Not going into detail because of time constraints. Important is that the $100 billion per year obligation has been confirmed, and it was agreed upon to have a new goal for collective mobilization beginning next year. And that is why this year in Baku we will discuss this. As you probably know, we have reached the goal of $100 billion per year only last year, or last year, somewhere in between. So the other way around, this goal has been failed to reach for several years, actually, which of course was not a good development for climate finance as such. And it shows already how complicated the issue is. Just one aspect with regard to the statistics and the counting. It is to a large extent unclear on what to add all to climate finance domestically and internationally, as we until today have no comprehensive and conclusive definition of a climate finance as such. This is in addition to what has been said with regard to the domestic legal and practical framework. This is one challenge, really. We do not know and how to count climate finance and what is all included, private and public. Anyway, what is, I would say, clear is that the challenge ahead is way bigger in terms of money than what we saw so far. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that at least we have a challenge of bigger than 6 times greater than the current level of climate finance that is needed in order to face all the challenges and to cope with them of climate change ahead. This is, however you want to count, as I said, IPCC said 6 times. UN UNCTAD even says more. We are discussing something of $6 trillion until 2030, and that is to say at least 600 billion a year. As again, currently it's 100 billion a year, probably even more. And that is the challenge we have, and it indicates already how far-reaching the Baku the COP29 is and how complicated, because it's a lot of money, negotiations are and will be. What are the key elements that are at stake and shape the current discussion, the political and diplomatic discussion? It's quantity, it's the question who are contributors, the time frame, the covered themes, the scope of climate finance, the quality of finance, and of course issues of transparency. I cannot touch upon all of them. Let me just highlight two and go a little deeper into that. That is which countries should contribute and what is the relationship between the global south and the global north with regard to climate finance obligations. The background for this is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that, as I already indicated, is a basic theme and a basic legal principle since the beginning of the international efforts, namely under the United Nations Framework Convention. This is indicated also in the Paris Agreement, and domestically we have quite some jurisprudence, follows up on what Justice just said on climate change obligations and also common but differentiated responsibilities, as probably, at least in my opinion, already by now customary international law, even though, of course, in a very broad definition, but as such, the principle as such, I would argue, is customary international law. We have a bit more concrete aspects in this regard by the advisory opinion of May this year on climate change and international law of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. It's a very important advisory opinion. It is the first we will see, as you probably know, an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice sometimes in the future. We have already human rights international court decisions, namely by the European Court of Human Rights. We will see an Inter-American Court of Human Rights decision. So the International Tribunals for the Law of the Sea is the first international court that has discussed climate change. And an aspect within the advisory opinion, an important aspect, is indeed financial assistance with regard to principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The court, the tribunal explicitly refers to the Paris Agreement and takes the content, so to speak, of the Paris and the United Framework Convention into interpreting the Law of the Seas provision. Important is what the tribunal said on obligations of, among others, financial support of developing countries in their efforts towards coping with climate change and fighting climate change. The tribunal, as you see, explicitly says that scientific, technical, educational, and other assistance to developing countries is an important aspect with regard to climate change, and an aspect that is part of the overall goal of a just and equitable international economic order, as the overall thing we are talking about. And it also refers in this regard to the financial capability of developing countries and financial assistance in this regard. So we do have some court language judgments here that might help us. That, however, doesn't answer the question. I'm coming to my last point. Who is obliged to support and to contribute to climate finance? Of course, to a large extent, it's developed countries for several reasons, for capability reasons, for historical reasons. But the big question is, what about the big group of developing countries? And as you might know, we are legally not differentiating within the group of developing countries. We only differentiate between least developed and developing countries, but in the big group of developing countries, we are not differentiating legally. And that leads to a situation that we have rather small developing countries in the same legal setting as huge developing countries, Brazil, China, and other countries. And that is one of the issues to discuss. Is that really what we want, to have all of those countries within one basket, or do we need more graduation, as it is called? Do we need more differentiated responsibility also within that big group of developing countries? I would say yes, and two arguments. First, we have already some indications in this regard in the Paris Agreement. If you look at Article 2 and Article 9 on aspects of who is financing, has an obligation to finance on what, there is a certain overlap, and you can see that probably certain developing countries have already a climate finance obligation under Paris. And secondly, we have in other areas of international law, international economic law, also a development in this regard of more differentiating in the large group of developing countries. The agreement on fisheries subsidies within the World Trade Organization has some language in this regard, talking about not only about differentiated responsibilities, but also about appropriate and effective special and differentiated treatment for developing countries. And this appropriate and effective indicates that within the group of developing countries, we may differentiate with regard to technical financial obligations. So I can only end with questions and challenges, not so many answers, because they depend to a large extent on diplomatic and political negotiations. But we see the challenges, and hopefully, and let's cross our fingers, we see some positive results coping with these challenges in Baku at COP29. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tite, for building the case for climate financing for developing countries, the common but differentiated responsibilities. And with your permission, we will keep your presentation on our conference website so that those who would like to consult it afterwards, they can actually log in and they can go to the slides. So if you agree. Thank you. Now, before I go to this issue of carbon markets and this whole issue of Article 6 of Paris Agreement, let me take our in-person panelist, Advocate Sohail Baland. Sorry? Okay. Okay. So, Sohail proposed that perhaps Dr. Petra from Durham University, she can speak around the Article 6 of Paris Agreement, and then he will give a local perspective. So thank you very much, Dr. Petra, for joining us from UK. Kindly, the floor is yours for Article 6 of Paris Agreement, and how does it relate to Pakistan as well, among all others. You have 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We all can hear you.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Abid, and all the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here, especially alongside very good friends and dear colleagues, Justice Javad and Christian Tite as well. And thank you for giving me the slot now. I'm indeed in a very unplanned manner on the train this morning, so I hope my connection will be very stable. Thank you again for the organizers to make this possible, that I can
nevertheless join. So I will share my screen with you. Hope that will work out fine here.
Oh, I think it says the host disabled participant screen sharing. Abhi, do you want me to send my slides to you because it says
Yes,
I
you can.
can't share my screen? Yeah, it says host disabled. Ah, now I can. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
You can share the screen. Please share it.
Yes, yeah, it's possible now. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to delve a little bit deeper into Article 6 and the rules that have emerged as part of the Paris Agreement rulebook on Article 6 in particular. And I think this will fit really nicely into what we've just learned from the previous two speakers, you know, the role of courts in adjudicating in this area. And I think this role of courts will only become more important, especially when we see investors investing in countries in certain projects. There needs to be a specific clause in these treaties, for example, to address the issue of investor-state dispute settlement that will be, I think, in the future, something that will concern all of us a bit more. And then it also ties in with what Christian just said about the role of states, but also private parties in financing projects. And I would like to especially focus on the private markets and how Article 6 can be used or leveraged to increase projects and to harness really the benefits from private investors investing in the crediting mechanism that Article 6 establishes, which is of course something very different, very new. We have now a compliance market because states can then also demonstrate compliance with their NDCs by acquiring these carbon credits. I will briefly end in the with a short explanation why these decisions that parties make in these COPs are relevant at all. So bear with me, but just at the outset to note these decisions of parties conferences have a legal value. Now, as you know, it was impossible to agree in 2021 at COP26. We were all coming out of COVID on the Paris Agreement, on all of the facets of the Paris Agreement rulebook for Article 6. Now, initially, of course, it should have been already agreed in 2018 as part of the Katowice climate package. So the Katowice conference was equally unable. It took another 3 years then to agree on a basic set of Article 6 rules. Now, the Katowice package, as we know, consists of 20 decisions. It's adopted several sets of guidance and rules on modalities and reporting. It also talks about the goal on finance, and we've heard on that already. I will skip that in the interest of time. Now, why do I even mention these? Because in 2018, the rules that were agreed then are still very relevant for what we are doing with Article 6, especially in terms of accounting and reporting, and it's important to keep that in mind. Now, for example, we've got the ICTU, the guidance to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding of NDCs, and that will be very relevant now when we come to the NDC submission in February 2025, 3.0 NDCs, where parties will have to demonstrate for the first time, for example, how the global stocktake and the outcomes of the global stocktake have informed them in preparation for their new NDCs. Now, for these new NDCs, the ICTU guidance will become mandatory. It was only a recommendation for the first NDCs, and this is why we've seen so many iterations of amended first NDCs instead of new NDCs, because then this guidance would have been an obligation to apply. Now, so parties will have to provide certain elements of information, and as you know, the first report under the Paris Agreement in terms of information will be submitted in December this year. Now, the substance of the ICTU is largely or has been developed in line with the decision that even dates back to 2015, the decision of COP1 CP22, which is of course the one that adopted the Paris Agreement, but already there the mandate was given to parties to develop further some of these requirements on transparency and understanding of NDCs. Some of these have been resolved, some have not been resolved. And this is, of course, something that is relevant when we come to a new mechanism that equally brings new issues, such as Article 6, because that is then tied in with the unresolved issues around some of the NDCs. So there are then in the decision from Katowice some more detailed provisions in terms of the enhanced transparency framework, in terms of mitigation co-benefits, for example, resulting from adaptation actions. And also it was agreed here how that parties need to inform the Secretariat in their new indices, how they have taken the global stocktake into account when they've developed their new NDCs, and how their NDCs contribute towards Article 2.1a, which is the temperature target, and Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement. Now, there was also an agreement on the guidance on accounting, and this becomes very important also again for Article 6, as you will see in a second, because there we have this strong emphasis on avoidance of double counting, for example. Now, so as a general rule, all these methodologies and metrics that parties will use in their accounting, be that for their NDCs or later on for the Article 6 Paris Agreement, have to be those that are assessed and approved by the IPCC. There are a few exceptions, and this is then when parties can demonstrate that they have used equally sound methodologies. And then, of course, there are also examples for least developed countries and small island and developing states. Now, crucially, parties must maintain consistencies across their NDCs. Now, in talking now what has been added in the Glasgow chapter, so COP21 finally saw us agreeing on some of the key issues on the Article 6 rulebook. As you know, we are still not sure. We haven't had no agreement last year in Dubai on Article 6.2, especially. It's only a draft negotiation text, and this year, hopefully, we will have some more certainty around the common nomenclatures, and also some more clarity on how we are treating avoided emissions under the crediting mechanism. Now, this is something that we've already heard. We know markets are important. They have been important even under the Kyoto Protocol, with all the deficits that the Kyoto Protocol had around down to the detail of, the CDM. No mechanism was provided by the CDM, for example, to scrutinize how human rights were observed in the processing of planning applications. This has now been resolved, by the way, because the Sustainable Development Mechanism has a mechanism by which concerns of communities have to be taken into account. But I think the critical point here is to take away that the existing instruments have to be improved, and innovation is needed to develop new mechanisms. And I think this is really something that cannot be stressed enough. And this is something where Pakistan has a huge potential to be leading in that region of the world and to attract finance. Now, Article 6 has three modalities. Two are market-based and one is non-market-based. I will not speak so much about Article 6.8 for that reason. Just say a few words about the cooperative approaches and the 6.4 mechanism. Now, what we know is that mitigation outcomes can be produced through these two mechanisms, and there are mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, if they are transferred internationally. They have to be, that was the initial knowledge we had before the Glasgow chapter was added, generated by a cooperative approach, and mitigation outcomes that are generated under Article 6.4 can also become an ITMO when they are transferred internationally. So from Glasgow, we know that these ITMOs have to have the characteristics of being real, verified, and additional which seems very concrete, but we will see that this is in fact where the real issues start. And of course, they can also be traded between Article 6.4 and Article 6.2. So if you have a sustainable development project that has generated an ITMO, it can be used as a crediting in the crediting process between two parties that have a cooperative approach. Now, so what is Article 6.2? There is a flexibility. These approaches are not subject to the oversight of parties. There is no central UNFCCC-based oversight mechanism in that sense, but they shall apply robust accounting to ensure inter alia the avoidance of double counting, consistent with guidance adopted by the CMA. And this is something that is, of course, an ongoing process. They must promote sustainable development, that is new. They must ensure environmental integrity and transparency and have in place robust accounting and avoidance of double counting. Article 6.4 are slightly different projects. They will operate under the authority and guidance of the CMA and are governed by a supervisory body, the Article 6 TER. So again, this is very similar to the CDM, but there are some new features that have been introduced, and the supervisory body, that's very important, has to approve the eligible methodologies for the mitigation activities, although some of these processes have already been watered down because parties can also have play a huge role in defining the baselines and the methodologies. Now, so major challenges that remain for Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 projects is, of course, that there's a considerable variety in NDC description. They use different metrics, they use different timeframes. So is it possible, for example, to buy all the carbon credits the year before the compliance demonstration is due? Some states have economy-wide targets, others have sector-specific targets, but maybe don't include all greenhouse gases. There's also up to now no environmental integrity definition. It is not entirely clear how the reporting intersects. What is clear is that under Article 6, there needs to be, with the issuance of the first carbon credit, an initial report, and there needs to be an annual and an update report. Another transparency issue is, as always, what will be reviewed under Article 6.4. Is it the quantitative information on the ITMOs used, or also the qualitative information? Now, with this, I'm coming to nearly the end. I hope I'm still okay for time. Otherwise, please shout at me. I can't really see much here apart from my own slides. So the definition of a corresponding adjustment, as you know, this was already introduced in the Katowice package, and it was hugely contentious at that time whether or not it would be possible to include it as a requirement, not knowing what the actual guidance for Article 6 would look like. The basic concept behind this corresponding adjustment is that the party who sells an NDC can no longer use it to demonstrate compliance towards its NDC, whereas the party that acquires or purchases this carbon credit can, of course, use it to demonstrate compliance. So that means the emissions of the selling party should go up as soon as the transfer has happened. Now, this is how I try to explain that. I've just come up with this little drawing, you know, where you see the seller and the buyer country, and it's the ITMO that goes then to the other country will affect your own carbon budget, which means you have used simply more of it. Now, this looks really, I think, quite common sense, but of course there are many issues around this. There is an issue around, you know, how do we track the process? How do we avoid that we no longer know where these once issued carbon credits actually are? How often have they been used? And some of these risks can materialize in good faith, actually, because I think the rules still need to be further drilled down and better understood. So, for example, we need to fully understand what is environmental integrity and what is additionality. And some of these lessons maybe can be learned from the Kyoto Protocol. Now, my final point here, as I said at the beginning, why is all of this important? These are only CMA or COP decisions, but these COP decisions are important, and this has been recognized by the International Court of Justice, but also by the International Law Commission. These are decisions in international law, and they have at least a strong effect for the development of the Paris Agreement. So you can debate, is this a new source of international law? Perhaps not, but there is an interpretative effect that really is important, and parties will need to observe this. So in designing national carbon markets, we need to take these rules that are set forth by COPs into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Petra, for demystifying Article 6 of Paris Agreement about its coverage, what is mandatory in it, what is voluntary and what's compulsory, the language, the source. I think it's indeed extremely important to understand the significance of language as well when we are talking of carbon markets. To take it further, Forum Lalani will also talk about this
financial governance in Pakistan. Forum, you have the floor for next 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the organization of this event. This is always an August gathering, and commendable. I must commend SDPI for organizing this annually. I really look forward to this annual event. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I think the points I have is really around the introspection. I believe I don't have the sharing rights. I'll just
MIS team, if you can allow him to share the screen, please. Screen sharing allowed.
Yeah. So let me know when the screen is visible, please.
Yes, it's visible now.
Thank you, sir. So I think just to start things off, my climate finance governance ideas are really an introspection on Pakistan's own systems. I think we really talk about a lot of the international climate finance, which is very, very important. But at the same time, it is extremely important to introspect and look where the governance points can be improved and can be strengthened. So I've got 3 talking points here. I'm not going to take a lot of time. Hopefully, in the next 7 to 8 minutes, I should be able to complete my points. My first perspective is around, giving science its own due place. I think what we've been seeing in Pakistan, I've always joked that I can summarize the entire climate change sector assessment of Pakistan in 10 seconds, because we don't really bring any science conversation into play. We talk about in Pakistan, climate change is equals to climate finance, and climate finance is pretty much around carbon markets or green climate fund. And, that is a very limited scope when we talk about climate governance. But really, I think if we see internationally how this conversation takes place, there's a lot of place for science, and we miss out on the science part. So I've got this slide, and this is just for elucidating. If I am unwell, let's suppose for a moment, and if I go to a doctor, and if my doctor has the tools available, which is the only tool that he has available is a hammer in his hand, then my immediate reaction would be to panic. And I would really panic because, I've gone to a doctor. I want to really see a doctor who's well versed with the science, with the biology of it. But all I see if, the only tool that he works with is the hammer, then I would really panic. And I think with climate, the kind of climate governance that we have set up in Pakistan is pretty much where we don't really talk about the science of it. What really goes inside. We don't really talk about those. So, for example, oceans is a very beautiful thing. Oceans are commendable.
But from a scientific perspective, there will rarely be discussions around how oceans work. Or, just to give an idea, oceans are the most beautiful things that God has created. But we rarely talk about oceans. We rarely talk about the fact that oceans sequester more than 50% of the carbon. Our focus has always been on the outside climate finance, the kind of inflows that we can really denominate in Pakistan. But we don't really talk about the kind of things that we need to improve. So if I have $10 million available tomorrow, where in Pakistan I would invest? In oceans, which oceans? In mountains, which mountains? In glaciers, which glaciers? And I think, science could really lead us to a lot of ideas. So we have a climate change policy, but just from a governance perspective, I think very important that we should also have land and soil use policy. Very important that we have coastal and marine policy. A forest framework. Pakistan doesn't really have any national forest framework. I mean, how many times have we daily identified that these are the forests that are endangered? These are the timelines, these are the activities that we are going to do, and this is the results that we expect. So I think science needs to be at the forefront, and I think all the climate change discussions around the governance aspect that we do, we really want to make sure that we have a scientific perspective in place. My second point, and I think, again, this is an introspection of sorts. I think that, we talk about the fuel of it, the driver, the finance, which is the fuel of it. But we don't really talk about the car that is using the fuel. And I think, in my humble opinion, we have been using a very old car now. The car to drive our processes or to, the fuel that we need is, really driven by this car. This is a very old car, 1950s car. But this is the car essentially that we are driving. All policymakers, they're driving this car. So no matter how much fuel that you really put into place, there is very less chance that you would go a lot more further because the car is not functioning. The car always gives you trouble here and there. And then there are more expectations that are coming from this car. Previously it used to be only education and health, and now it is artificial intelligence. Now it is climate finance. Now it is, all the latest technology that we really want countries to prosper. But at the end of the day, all that we have is this car. Everyone is going to drive this car. So unless we really remodel this car, make it functionable again, so that we get more mileage out of the finance that we have. And this is really about, the local governance that we need to make sure that we put in place so that we get maximum mileage out of the finance that we mobilize. So as I said, I think the vulnerability is really that our own car, looking at Pakistan,
it's a very slow moving car. It's a very overly worked car. And this is a very broad example, but all I want to show here is that this is one area, our ex-FATA areas, and this is the kind of subsidies that we have provided on electrification. It is amounting to around roughly 200 billion rupees in the last 10 years. Had we just electrified with 200 billion rupees, had we just electrified FATA with solar electricity, high quality solar panels, we would have electrified them 3 times over. So even if I have 100 billion rupees available right now, right today, unless we change the car, unless we change the thinking, unless we change the governance processes, we will just end up utilizing our money, utilizing the finance, not very prudently and not very efficiently. So one of the things that I've always done, I've always asked people, especially in the planning ministries, as what do they really think, of the planning governance. So we've got PC1, PC2, PC3, 4, and 5. We make PC1s and PC2. We rarely make PC4 and PC5. PC5 is essentially when we do an ex-post evaluation. We don't make, we really don't do any ex-post evaluation. 90% of the time, our projects really don't have any ex-post evaluations. So again, this is an internal governance mechanism that we need to strengthen. If I want to get the maximum mileage out of my car, I want to make sure that whatever that I intend to do,
at least gets documented. And if I can evaluate it in an objective, rational manner, I think that's only going to add the overall efficacy of it. My final point around this is, I think at a lot many times, I think we need to really start the virtuous cycle of investments. Again, this is an introspection into our own governance framework. So I think I would really want to emphasize that a lot many times we see that the industries are not getting mobilized. They're not getting the right financing. And what we need to do, I think we have a template available. All the international countries have done this. This is one example. We are all aware of it. This is Lahore. Very recently, we understand that Lahore has been suffering from great smog problem. But at the same time, I think one of the key to sort of lessen the smog issue is to have electric vehicles and to make sure that the air becomes cleaner, the transport becomes cleaner. But where are we exactly on the electric vehicles component? At this one time, we are suffering. This is a vicious cycle. EVs have less demand because the battery costs are very high, and very few people could afford it. And then here, this is where the governments really come in. This is where the governments come in, and they really try to turn this vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. So, what can they do? They can give people incentives. They can give them subsidies. They can announce that they will not tax EV companies. They will give discounts on land costs and import duties. And the moment that you do this, these are fiscal incentives right at the beginning. The moment that you do this, you essentially end up having a virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle is that the cost goes down, the demand increases, the production increases, and then the entire industry becomes functioning. And this is the functioning industry that we require.
In a lot many stages and a lot many sectors, Pakistan really needs a virtuous cycle of industrial growth. So I think I'm not in any way, I don't want to propagate that subsidies, we should really rely on subsidies. And I think my last point is that why subsidies are essential. And I think we have Inflation Reduction Act, $2.2 trillion, not a small subsidy package. It's a humongous subsidy package by the US. China, we have seen giving subsidies at a scale which is unfathomable. And then we have this. The point is that perpetual subsidies are not. I think perpetual subsidies are regressive. We don't want to give perpetual subsidies, but we want to give subsidies. We want to give fiscal incentives so that we really get a head start in a lot of industries which we really need for our growth. And I think Justice Jawad had mentioned State Bank's role, and that is where I think the State Bank's role and the SECP role and the Government of Pakistan role really comes into play. That now we have a financing framework. We want to make sure that we've got right fiscal incentives aligned, and we start the process. We start the virtuous process so that we can have the industries. Once we have the industries, then we can tax them. In 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, we can recover all the money that we have invested upfront, make sure that they are not perpetual subsidies. We want market players to come and ensure that we've got a good thing in motion. So I stop here. But again, these are introspection points on the climate finance, on the local climate finance governance framework. Back to you, Suleri sir.
Thank you very much, Lalan Sab. And now towards the very end, last but not least, our in-person presenter here, Suhail Buland. You heard all of this, and you have some heavy toll of summarizing the 4-5 presentation and without repetition, trying to make your point on climate finance. And we have again around 10
Let's talk about six
Fes. Okay, so why is this relevant to us, right? Why is climate finance relevant to us? There's talk now about rooftop solar associations turning their consumer base into actual carbon credit projects. So there's a way that you can earn carbon credits because you're taking the obviously GHG out of the environment. But to do that, you need a viable and a sustainable legal framework to allow the real consumers to participate in the economy and get the benefits from their investments in greener technologies, in greener products. So that's why we're here. We're here to talk about the legal framework and its importance to us all. We'll start the presentation with some facts and figures. I think these are very important. Pakistan, as you know, is 5th most affected country. Loss and damage commitments aside, we have, although we have suffered immensely year on year, but the levels of the financing that we've received, whether it is in mitigation efforts or whether it is in adaptation efforts, remains abysmally low. As you can see, $4 billion have been invested in Pakistan, as opposed to tens of billions in our neighboring countries. This is some of the figures that are relevant to Pakistan. I think by 2050, can you go to the next slide? Next slide. By 2050, our financial needs are 348 billion, 152 to support adaptation and resilience, 196 for mitigation efforts. Now the million-dollar question, or rather the billion-dollar question is, how on earth do we attract this kind of funding that this country needs? This country is already, the image is very poor in the international community. We have credibility issues. All the indices, whether you have human rights indices, law and order indices, rule of law indices, we are probably in the top 10. So it's a big question to my mind as to how we can actually create the appropriate ecosystem to attract this kind of money. So we can keep crying in every international forum that we have suffered, but money will only flow when there is a transparent, functioning, and a sustainable ecosystem. Please, next slide. We've covered this. So we've barely managed to raise $4 billion, up till now. Next slide. So this is just it's also disproportionate, as you can see. 79% of the funds that Pakistan has received so far have gone to mitigation, 21 only for adaptation, whereas our economy really needs adaptation financing to cope with the climate crisis. Next. This is a sector-wise breakdown of where the different priority sectors have been receiving financing. Energy, of course, is the highest, and agriculture is the lowest. When the great floods come, when the great deluge comes, when it hits us, it is the agricultural sector that takes the biggest hit. But up till now, we've not been able to attract enough financing in the very important sector in Pakistan. Next, please.
This is the look. So to create bankable products, to encourage our domestic banks and including international banks to invest in climate financing, you have to understand the risk appetite. So the low-hanging fruits are the renewable energy generation projects, and State Bank came with the very successful renewable financing scheme, the fruits of which we are all enjoying today in terms of having cheaper and cheaper solar power disposable to available to us. And for some reason, this scheme has been discontinued this year. So this aspect also needs to be put on the table because there's a huge demand for solar. EVs, another major stream, which is low risk. The hybrid sector is doing extremely well in Pakistan. And in fact, previous week, where we were discussing with the EV industry and the banks and insurers, the request was for the State Bank and for SECP to create a EV and hybrid policy. And they're not asking for subsidies. That's the most important thing and most interesting fact. Nobody was asking for subsidies, subsidies or tax breaks or these kinds of incentives. All they asked for was consistency in policy. They asked for clarity. They asked for increasing the loan limits and caps to their products. So essentially creating a healthy environment for financing to flow through. And even more interestingly, the banks and insurers complemented this demand of the industry.
So let's hope when State Bank actually comes up with a legal taxonomy or classification of climate financing, they will include these recommendations as part of their process. Next, please. Thank you. So this is the gives you an example of the comparative example of debt financing. Pakistan has only raised 500 million. There's a green WAPDA bond. It did well, but quite a long time ago. And since then, there's been no capitalization on that initial excellent effort by the Ministry of Energy. Another outcome of these discussions with the banks and the financial sector regulators was the Islamic financing portfolio. Now we were, because Mizan Bank was there, Dubai Islamic was there, two other Islamic banks were there, and their association was there as well. And they said in our group that we are flush with cash, but we don't have enough products. We don't have enough products. Please help us create products, Islamic products, so we can market these products to the real economy. And a couple of things that they came up with one was the idea of Waqf. They requested the State Bank to assist them develop a Waqf policy or some kind of guidelines over Waqf. They also are very interested in supporting the rural sector on electrification, on crop processing. But again, the issues are NEPRA, the issues is net metering. They would like to have these issues resolved before they make their commitments. Next, please. Okay, carbon markets. So we saw Dr. Petra and Dr. Tijal speak about international treaties. How is carbon market actually created in Pakistan, and what are the benefits? Carbon market is basically a commodity. In Pakistan, carbon credit is essentially a commodity. In Pakistan, we have yet to legislate or declare a carbon credit as a commodity. And I'll discuss this in more detail. But until you classify a carbon credit as a commodity, the kind of climate financing infrastructure cannot be built if you don't do that. So the integrity of the market, what it does is you need to create a credible market for carbon credits and carbon trading. What this basically means is that you got to have a certain clear classification system. You have to have a framework, whether it's different rules in different regulated sectors or one overarching legal act which covers the whole framework of climate financing. Then very importantly, confidence of the buyers and investors. This basically means that whatever carbon projects that you are promoting through climate finance, they are de-risked from greenwashing and bogus claims. And that's a real concern, especially for Pakistan, as Pakistan already suffers from a trust deficit internationally. So we need to introduce a system where Carbon Standards Institute is made in Pakistan. Hopefully the regulators and the government come up with one a multi-stakeholder Carbon Standard Institute, the job of which would be to domesticate or incorporate all the international carbon standards, whether if it's forestry standards under REDD, or whether it's transport sector, or if it's Pakistan Engineering Council and the Council of Architects standards. So all these standards need to be adopted and domesticated in Pakistan. And then you need to have high quality auditors, third-party auditors. These are called validation and verification bodies. These high quality auditors need to ensure that the claims made by the project proponent are true and are valid. So we need to create this infrastructure. And unfortunately, I was a proponent that less laws are better. But after having gone through this cycle of conferences, seminars, discussions, I am sincerely of the view that you need a unified legal framework to support all these activities. The other important aspects of carbon projects is protection of rights and safeguarding the consumers and the communities. That's a very important aspect. Gender protection is at the forefront. The communities need to be properly involved in carbon projects before you roll them out. They must be given their due share in benefits. Transparency we discussed. Next slide, we'll talk about the legal certainty. So Pakistan is not the only jurisdiction where there is uncertainty around legal classification of carbon credits. If you look at the UNCITRAL statement, it clearly says that different jurisdictions characterize carbon credits differently. But we can adopt a few existing models. Since we are a Commonwealth country, we should look at other Commonwealth countries of the world, like UK and Australia. In UK, while there is no definition, it's generally recognized as an intangible property. And in the US, it's a commodity. And in Australia, it's personal property. Why are these classifications important? Because the financial institutions need to know what kind of legal instrument they need to create, what kind of use case, what kind of products they need to create, whether it's transferable, whether it's assignable, whether it can be hypothecated, whether there can be derivative transactions constructed on it. What's the treatment of carbon credits in an insolvency scenario? So the legal certainty and classification is extremely important for the market to take shape. Next, please. Pakistan, it could take couple of options Pakistan has. We could use various definitions of movable property in the Transfer of Property Act. We can use definition of movable property and goods in Sale of Goods Act, which we'll discuss in a bit. And then there are other issues, as you can see. How do these carbon credits affect your tax liability? We talked about the collaterals. What are the accounting principles around carbon credits? Has ICAP and SECP come up with a system on how to create accounting standards or adopt accounting standards? I know that there's a process in place, and hopefully by 2025, the International Sustainability Standards Board accounting principles will be adopted by SECP and as well as the accounting community. Next, please. Yeah. So one option is that you use existing legislation to make the classification intervention. And Sales of Good Act is one place where you can classify carbon credits as a good. This will have the benefit of recognition of the term carbon credit. But I feel that, and there's a debate here, like whether we can go to the next slide also. Can you go to the next slide? I just want to go to the debate. Sorry, behind. Yeah. So there's a debate of what approach to take. Do we take, and both approaches are going to involve a lot of work, and it has to be a national effort and a whole of society effort. One approach is, do we make an overarching act of parliament that regulates climate finance, voluntary carbon markets, carbon credits, and carbon registry, one window facility, so on? Or whether do we make interventions in various sectoral laws? This is something I leave to you and the experts, but my personal opinion is I think the scale of the problem is so huge. And given our own country's own peculiar characteristics of working in silos and bunkers and of being afraid to get out of your foxholes, I think one overarching legislation would be the appropriate way forward. Because rules are backed by one government department or the other. If MOCC comes up with rules to regulate voluntary carbon market, then State Bank might not fully apply them, or SCCP might not fully apply them, or the Transport Department might not fully apply them. That is why I recommend that there has to be one overarching framework. And Mansoor Saab also said, Justice Mansoor Shah Saab also said in our conference that it is the Parliament's job to debate this thoroughly and make an enabling environment for climate finance. Now, can we go back? So I want to talk about the possible solutions also. Once you have that enabling legal framework, then obviously when laws are made, it's made with musharat, it's made with consensus, it's made with stakeholder consultations. State Bank of Pakistan, how do we galvanize the market? Do we give incentives? Do we give tax benefits? Do we give tax relief? We all know that IMF is not going to allow us to do that. So we need to come up with more innovative solutions to protect to incubate this market, and so that this market grows. My suggestion is that carbon credits should be made part of the export control, the export list. Products that are exported in Pakistan do not have tax liability. And carbon credit by its very nature is an exportable product. So that way we can at least satisfy our donors and our financiers that we're not deviating from our major commitments. Next, please. Next. Can you go one more? Yeah. So this is this one thing last thing I need to say is that, it's how we approach a particular problem. In our culture, there's a lot of letter writing. One department writes to the other to give comments. The process is sluggish. The process is bureaucratic. We need to come up with more active solutions, more active ways to deal with this climate finance problem and generally climate change issues. And the workshop that we did, SDPI was one of the stakeholders in the workshop. We worked with SDPI, IBA, State Bank, SCCP, National Institute of Banking and Finance, my law firm, Khurram Lalani's consulting firm. It was an interdisciplinary effort to get the multiple stakeholders out of their comfort environments under a methodology and into a working environment where they sat together and came up with real solutions and to encourage
the flow of financing in the real economy. And the outcome of this was, it was very much appreciated. At the second day of the event, the recommendations were given to a high-level plenary event. Jisme Secretary of Finance, Additional Secretary Finance was there, Additional Secretary Climate Change was there, Governor State Bank, SECP Chairman, and this kind of active solutions to a really large and existential problem needs to be created. If you can go back, this one, yeah. So these are the solutions or recommendations were given by the universities. This is IBA, the Institute of Business Administration. We had a session with the IBA, with University of Cambridge, with King's College, and a couple of other training providers, international and local. And they came up with these recommendations. Higher Education Commission, and the reason why I'm choosing this, because I think climate education is the biggest gap in this country. People really don't understand climate. They don't understand climate science. More importantly, our leaders, regulators, and business leaders are under-equipped to deal with the climate challenge because of lack of knowledge. So Higher Education Commission and education boards should declare a climate emergency and not only do awareness, but ensure that their constituents, the various universities, whether it's an engineering university or an agricultural university or a business school, that they start developing climate capacity in their faculties and departments and education centers. Mandatory climate education programs for regulated sectors. SBP, SECP, Pakistan Engineering Council should require mandatory climate education or certification in order for their regulated sector leaders to sit on their boards or to act as senior managers. And you must specially target high association, trade association bodies. So this is for example, the cement sector. They have a trade association and body to lobby the government for regulatory change, but they should be made to undergo a climate certification program, which is specific to their own sector. Similarly, the major oil and gas companies. Only then, I think, can solutions be, will present themselves. Because if there's such a huge knowledge gap, I don't know what you would expect. Academia industry linkages, partnerships between academia and industry using ORIC, especially the Office of Research and Incubation and Innovation. Global partnerships was emphasized, and so on. Thank you.
I can take around 2 questions. Any question from the floor? Ladies and gentlemen, I think, oh yes, but sir.
It's concerning climate finance. Since these carbon credits are traded globally, how important is it to have a local market? Can we just use the global market and hopefully the local domestic market will develop over time? But how important is it
to have the local market for carbon credits?
Thank you so much for the insightful discussion. My question would be, how we can incorporate provincial issues, subnational governments into the legal framework, because when it comes to climate injustice, if there is a global South and global North debate, there is a climate injustice debate within a country itself. So how we can take that into these legal frameworks?
Jawad Sahab, can I come to you first? Would you like to address any of these?
I think I think we can ask Dr. Christian, he has to go somewhere, let him answer first. Because Petra had to go. Dr. Christian can answer the question first and I'll answer it later. So he has to leave. Yes, Dr. Christian?
Thank you very much. Just very briefly on both questions. First, I think it's very important to have also local markets. That's purely from an economic perspective, as we know that they are quite efficient. And therefore, as broader we have them, international, regional, locally, as better it is. And in terms of domestic injustice, let's say, I think what we can do from an international perspective is to create obligations for transparency and participation. Participation is most crucial in this regard, as at least from international perspective, we cannot impose, so to speak, specific rules on how to overcome inequalities and injustices within a certain domestic community or a state or other more regional entity, but we can, from an international law perspective, impose rules on participation and transparency in order to overcome the issues you mentioned on a more procedural basis. Thank you. And I'm very much afraid I have to go now. Thank you very much for this very challenging and interesting conference, and I hope to see all of you again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine, for joining and participating online. We hope to be able to remain in touch in future as well. Thank you. Jawad साहब, आप कुछ ऐड करना चाह रहे हैं?
The answer would be that we have to take one thing in mind, that Pakistan has already suffered so much that we have to be very positive mind, as I spoke about. Environment is with us for the last 41 years, it's 83 law. We don't need to reinvent anything now because of the issues involved. That now, as I told you, there mostly people are doing climate credit through the agreements now. If you all can start, because there is the legal framework that Pakistan Constitution recognizes this right, and the laws are there for you and judgments are there for you. The corporate lawyers can start the agreements with the various clause and the recital mentioning the Pakistan's constitutional articles and also the courts and also the commitment of Pakistan. So the question would be that we can understand the good that we start the carbon credit as a good, because that is defined under definition. I can see Mr. Hamid Sharif Sahab sitting here, who has authority on international science fiction. He worked with the ADB, AIB. I can see Satul Sahab here. These are the people who have worked with these international multinational banks here. We don't need to ask that we have to start a new law. As I said, we have the SCCP Act, which can give the guidelines. We have the State Bank Act, ordinance, we have these things, because we have to start the work now. Lawyers should keep in mind that we have to be positive. We need funding soon. We need to give them a good comfort for Pakistan, because once we give this kind of thing, everything is with us now. All lawyers can sit down and look at the legal framework of Pakistan. It's almost 40 years ago. And you can ask Hamid Sharif Sahab, who you can see in the beginning, I can see him. He is the one who has been leading Pakistan in every big bank. He can answer that two good answers. Buland Sahab, Hamid Sahab se baat kar puchiye zara, he can ask you the question.
Ji Buland, aap.
Hamid Sahab.
Thank you very much, Jawad. Thank you, Abid Saab. I think you've really had a fantastic panel this afternoon. And the main reason I was here because of the panelists and the quality of panelists. But sadly, the acoustics are so atrocious that I really struggled to hear what many of the speakers have said.
Fortunately, some of you had slides, and so that has helped. I'm not going to directly engage with the question of international financing, but I think there's a much larger issue. I think on the law side, Pakistani courts have been really far ahead of the game. And congratulations in particular to the Lahore High Court, when Justice Mansoor was there and Jawad Hassan and Shahid Kareem currently. I think they've done a sterling job in terms of the decisions which we've seen coming from that court, and of course, the Supreme Court recently. But I think what we're not seeing on the executive side is any enthusiasm for climate change. And that is reflected in the fact that there's hardly any budget for climate change. In Bulland, you made some excellent suggestions on how to create capital markets and so on. But where is the capacity? You don't see that capacity in the SECP. You don't see that in the State Bank. You don't see any leadership. I was, as country director for ADB in China, I was involved in trying to help the Chinese to set up carbon markets. And I can tell you, it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of engagement from the state and its agencies to set up a market like that. Now, I don't see anyone from the state in the panel even. So I think, folks, we have a real issue and an emergency in Pakistan where the executive branch, which is in charge of the budget, which should have the resources and capacity, is absolutely missing in action when it comes to climate change. And I think this is, for me, a major takeaway. We can make all the fancy speeches and recommendations we like here, but the reality is nothing will be done because the executive is missing in action. Thank you.
My question would be like, as you just suggested, I was just thinking like, as we all are busy creating these kinds of conferences all the year round with beautiful suggestions. So what do you think after this panel discussion and after this conference, after 4 or 5 days, what would you suggest can be a collaborative effort between public and private sector and all the social sector, and how we all can advocate and push the government, especially because they are the ones, as he just suggested, to come up with new policies and all kind of climate budgets. So what is the plan after this? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Moin Saab, I'll take your I'll try to address it. So there are carbon project markets happening, but they're few and far between because of the cost is so high to put up such a project. Just to get a validation done, I think the quote I received on one of the projects was $300,000 to $400,000. So these are the real constraints. Of course you can, but it'll be probably in the PE space or a private, VC space that this can happen, B2B. But to get the climate financing volumes that we need, I think, just as Hamid Saab said, that you need the state machinery to come behind. And our experiences with the regulators was that they've never really been consulted.
Either in terms of the voluntary carbon markets framework or in terms of climate financing legal framework. So our conference with SDPI last week, the Deputy Governor State Bank came, SECP Chairman came, then the heads of departments came. When the leadership comes, then everybody follows. And the quality of the discussions and the quality of recommendations were acute, were focused, and were clear because of that leadership happened to be in the same room. That's extremely important to get people out. I think यहाँ एक question था on subnational. If you want me to answer, I can, or give my thoughts. Yeah, we can wrap up.
Thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful discussion. We do have ambitions for climate finance, but in order to get benefit from this climate finance, we require a legal landscape in which we are clearly lagging behind. We need to get some clarity on its regulatory challenges. We need to get clarity on investors' assurances that other nations, if they would be offering some market opportunities, how would it be dealt? We also need to take care of the federal government and provincial governments' potential issues, because most of the natural resources that can be used to earn carbon credits, those come under the mandate of provincial government. And all these questions, they require legal answer. And this panel was slightly unique in a way that we had jurists and the speakers from legal fraternity rather than the quote unquote the technical experts from climate change who was giving us other side of the picture. Now, the question here was quite important. What would be the fate of what is discussed here? We are going to COP29 next week, 11 till 22nd of November. And the recommendation and the discussions that we're doing in this conference, that would directly feed into our negotiation strategy. Ministry of Climate Change is our knowledge partner in this conference, and I am part of the delegation along with few other colleagues who are here. So whatever words of wisdom we are collecting from here, we'll synthesize it and we'll try incorporating it in our negotiation strategy. So it would have a direct national as well as international impact. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining here. 5:30 बजे यहाँ पे एक और बहुत अच्छा पैनल हो रहा है जिसमें वर्ल्ड बैंक के कंट्री डायरेक्टर होंगे, IMF की कंट्री रैप होंगी, UNDP के कंट्री डायरेक्टर होंगे और डॉक्टर शांता देवराजन जिन्होंने श्रीलंका की डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग की है, वो हमें जॉर्ज टाउन यूनिवर्सिटी वाशिंगटन से ज्वाइन कर रहे होंगे सीन सेटिंग के लिए। और उसके बाद द 3 मल्टीलैटरल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस, उनके हेड से हम जान रहे होंगे कि बांग्लादेश और श्रीलंका से हम किस तरह के लेसन जो है वो लर्न कर सकते हैं अबाउट अवर इकोनॉमिक रेजिलियंस। तो सारा दिन आज हमने क्लाइमेट रेजिलियंस को डिस्कस किया है, लेकिन इकोनॉमी भी उतना ही इम्पोर्टेंट पार्ट एंड पार्सल है हमारे इस रेजिलियंस का, जिसको हम तलाश करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। सो प्लीज़ 5:30 बजे दोबारा इसी हॉल में है या नीचे ऑडिटोरियम में है? इसी हॉल। तो अगर आप इसी हॉल में 5:30 बजे तशरीफ लाएं, बाहर कार्ट्स पे चाय और कॉफ़ी वगैरह है और फूड कोर्ट में भी आपको कुछ लाइट स्नैक्स मिल जाएंगे। नीचे एक्सपो को भी विजिट कीजिए और 5:30 विल मीट अगेन। थैंक यू वेरी मच।